I'm the footballer with the most titles in history, with 43 trophies, but I've been in prison for 7 months. I'm Dani Alves, a soccer legend, considered by many to be the best right back in history. But that was before. That belongs to the past. The glory, the trophies and the fans are over. Since January 10th, 2023, I've been imprisoned in a Barcelona jail. A young woman accused me of raping her. The facts date back to December 22nd, 2022, in a Barcelona discotheque. The situation deeply affected me, but I believed in justice and let it do its work. But since then, I've been plunged into confusion. I feel as if my life is collapsing in front of me. I'm losing everything. My girlfriend has left me, my club has sacked me and is demanding €4.5 million, and all my sponsors like Adidas have terminated their contracts with me. The worst thing for me is still prison. Living conditions are disastrous and I have no privileges. I don't eat anything. I spend all day hiding in my cell. As soon as I go out, to the canteen for example, I'm violently insulted and scorned by everyone. Despite this, I continue to proclaim my innocence and I hope one day to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
This woman committed such a heinous crime that the people of Aberdeen were demanding her blood. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the murder of Helen Priestley. 8-year-old Helen lived on a first-floor flat in this block of flats in Aberdeen with her parents Agnes and John. She was described as a quiet but confident young girl, however not everybody had glowing opinions on her. The neighbours who lived below them, the Donald family, did not get along with the Priestleys. The two mothers, Agnes Priestley and Janie Donald, had had a massive falling out years before and they never made up after it. They had been falling out for so long that neither of them could even remember why they had fallen out in the first place. It was said that Helen would torment the Donald family. She would kick their door in when she was passing it to go upstairs to her flat. She would shake the banister to cause a racket, and she supposedly relentlessly bullied Janie's daughter. So this, along with much more, made Janie really resent Helen, and she would be nasty to her. She would shout at her, scowl at her, and sometimes even chase her. On the 20th of April 1934, Agnes sent Helen along to the bakery to pick up a loaf of bread at around 1:30 p.m. As time was starting to pass, Agnes was noticing that Helen wasn't back home when she should be. She shouldn't have been taking this long, so she set out trying to find Helen, going to the bakery first. The baker confirmed that Helen had been and she had bought a loaf of bread, so Agnes made her way back up the flat, and when she found that Helen wasn't there, she started to worry. After some time had passed and Helen still wasn't home, overcome with fear, Agnes contacted the police and reported her daughter missing. This began one of the biggest searches in Aberdeen's history. Hundreds of volunteers aided in trying to help find Helen. They searched everywhere. They searched back gardens, abandoned building, all the alleyways, every single nook and cranny. They left no stone unturned, but Helen was nowhere to be found. The search went on all through the night despite the torrential rain. At around 2 a.m, after much persuasion, John, who was Helen's dad, made his way back to the flat with a friend named Alex. This is Alex, who was an upstairs neighbour to the Priestleys. John was exhausted. He had been at the forefront of the searches, desperately trying to find his daughter for hours upon end. Alex convinced him that in his exhausted state, he might not be as thorough in his search of Helen than he would be if he was energised. Alex assured John that they would go home, just have a couple of hours rest, get some energy back, and then they'd be both back up out searching. 5 a.m. eventually came round and Alex had left his flat, which was above the Priestleys, and tried to creep downstairs past the Priestleys' flat. He knew that John needed the extra rest, so being the good friend that he was, he kept his promise on getting a couple of hours rest and then going back out to rejoin the search. So as he's creeping down the stairs, he notices something on the ground floor that's out of place. There was a big bright blue bag that wasn't there when he and John had came in the flat at 2 a.m. He knelt down on the floor and unzipped the bag, discovering the body of 8-year-old Helen. It was found that Helen had been strangled to death, mutilated and raped. From inside the bag, investigators were able to extract foreign hairs that didn't belong to Helen. They noticed on the blue bag there was like a faded Canadian export stamp. It was found that these bags would be used to deliver flour, which led the investigators back to that bakery. When questioned, the baker admitted that yes, this bag had belonged to him and he had many of these bags. However, a woman had recently come in asking if she could borrow some, so he gave some to her. He didn't know this woman's name and he just gave police a very vague description of her. Something else that was interesting about the bag was that both the outside and the inside were bone dry. Now, as I mentioned, on the night of this search, it was pouring down with rain, so it would have been impossible for someone to walk through the streets with this bag without getting it wet, but also without being seen by the hundreds of people that are searching the streets for Helen. Police began to do door-to-door inquiries, beginning with everyone who lived in the flats. Everyone in the flats commented on Jeannie and her dislike of Helen and the fact that the Donald family were one of the only people who didn't participate in searching for Helen, and how it was a coincidence that this bag was found on the ground floor, the same floor that the Donald family lived on. Police questioned both Jeannie and her husband Alexander. I couldn't find exactly what prompted their arrest, but both of them were arrested. Alexander was quite quickly let go after many witnesses said that they had seen him in work in a barber shop the whole day that Helen had went missing, so that only left Jeannie. The public, who were given all of the details regarding Helen's murder, could not understand how a woman could inflict such a horrific death and sadistic injuries on an 8-year-old girl. They were absolutely outraged, and when they heard that Jeannie was getting arrested, they all kind of gathered around the flat ready to lynch her when she came out. Alexander and their daughter were actually forced to move out of Aberdeen because of the harassment and the death threats that they were constantly receiving. Jeannie's trial began on the 16th of July 1934 at Edinburgh Crown Court, where she pled not guilty. The prosecution had mountains of evidence against her though, including witnesses who had heard screaming coming from the direction of her flat. A professor from Glasgow University had compared the hairs that were found in the bag that Helen was found in to hairs from a brush that Jeannie had used in prison, and he determined that they were a perfect match. And much more, they actually had over 160 witnesses. Her defence was that it was shown that Helen had been raped, and apparently a woman couldn't do that. However, it was deemed that the injuries that Helen had sustained, which made it appear that she had been raped, were actually from household items. The jury deliberated for a very small 18 minutes before coming back with their verdict. 38-year-old Jeannie Donald was found guilty of the murder of 8-year-old Helen Priestley. This was one of the first times that forensic had aided in convicting someone, because forensics was still so new back then. Jeannie would go on to be sentenced to death, however an appeal saw this reduced to life imprisonment. Throughout her times behind bars, she was described as a model prisoner who was very warm, friendly, and considered a mother figure. In 1944, 10 years after Helen's murder, Jeannie's husband was diagnosed with cancer and was really poorly. Due to her good behaviour, she was granted compassionate leave so that she could leave the prison to care for her dying husband. After he passed, she was actually allowed to stay out, much to the disappointment of Helen's family and the general public. Jeannie died at 81 years old in 1976, never saying why she murdered Helen and never ever admitting it either.
This true crime lover killed someone just to know what it would feel like. This is something that happened this year, and it is absolutely mind-blowingly insane. Hi, I'm Meg. I talk about true crime. Let's get into this case. May 27th, 2023 at 3 a.m. in South Korea, a young girl is picked up by a taxi driver. According to him, she looked really young and she was carrying what seemed to be a very heavy suitcase. He offered to help her lift the suitcase into his boot, but she refused. I'm sure we all know by now what's in that suitcase. She gets in the car and he says, where do you want to go? And she says, a park. And he was thinking, like, what is this high school looking girl doing going to a park at 3 a.m.? Bit suspicious, with a suitcase. So they drive there in complete silence and they get to the park. She gets out of the car, takes her heavy suitcase, and walks into the forest. Because it was 3 a.m., he was a little bit worried about her safety and was wondering what she was up to. So he decided to stick around the park in case she needed a ride back, and he smoked a cigarette outside of his car. Shortly after, she did return, and this time the suitcase didn't seem so heavy anymore. I think you know what I mean, like you can really tell when someone's carrying a heavy suitcase versus a really light one, because it almost like it's too easy to carry, like lifts off the floor and stuff. As he predicted, she actually did ask for a ride to get back to where she came from, and the whole thing just seemed very off to the taxi driver. When he was in the car, he said that he felt pretty unsettled, like there was some sort of vibe. Shortly after dropping the girl off, he actually got in contact with the police and told them all about this situation. And it's a good thing he did, because police would end up searching that park, and they did in fact find dismembered human remains. I can't imagine what the driver must have felt knowing that he carried that in his vehicle, but thank God that he kind of picked up on the vibe, because this might have never been solved. It didn't take long for police to find the girl in the back of the cab. This girl was named Yu Young, sorry if I'm saying it wrong, and she was 23 years old. Now her whole entire story is just off-putting. According to everyone who went to school with Yu Young, she was... the word shy doesn't even begin to explain. She was shyer than shy. She was a complete recluse. Is that even a word? I don't know. When people would attempt to speak to her, she wouldn't even acknowledge that they spoke to her. She never attempted to make any friends in school. She was just happy living on her own, and she wasn't really sad or angry. Most of the time, a high school student that completely isolates themselves, you know, usually give off a kind of sad or angry vibe, but she was neutral at all times. Nothing really bothered her, and she was never really bullied or anything. It was just her and herself. She wasn't like the smartest kid in her class. She didn't really apply herself to much. When she graduated high school, she tried to get a job at this golf course, and when they called her for an interview, they started asking her questions, and she just wouldn't reply. And because she didn't reply to any of the questions, obviously, she didn't get the job. When she found out that she hadn't gotten this job, she was so mad, and she rang them back and like swore at them down the phone. And they were like, oh, the only reason you didn't get it is because you don't speak like English good enough. That was their kind of throwaway excuse to make her feel better. But this comes into play later. Moving forward to when she was arrested, they asked her like, who do the remains belong to? Her initial response was that she had a baby, and then after pregnancy had a psychotic break and killed the baby and buried it. Police knew right away that this was a lie, because the body they found was not one of a baby, but an adult. So already they were like, why are you lying? Police started searching through her phone to find any clue to who this might be, or what the motive might be, were they in contact, etc., etc. But they were shocked when they started searching her phone, and she spoke to literally no one. She didn't have any contacts, she didn't have any friends. She was a fully isolated person, and in 2023, that is hard to come by. One thing they did find, though, was a very interesting search history. Now, it was very clear from her search history that she was very, very, very obsessed with true crime. She loved watching documentaries about serial killers, murderers, all of that, which we all have interest in, but she was very interested. She was also looking up disposal options for bodies and how to not get caught. I'll tell you what, don't Google it if you don't want to get caught, maybe. Police ended up identifying the victim. Now, I literally can't find her name anywhere, so I'm just going to call her V for victim. V was a young woman in her 20s. She was apparently very successful. She went to a very high-class university. And according to what I could read, she was everything that Yu Jung was not. Between graduating high school and turning 23, Yu Jung didn't do anything. She kept to herself, literally hardly left the house. She didn't get that job because she didn't speak enough English, and V was an English tutor. Police ended up confronting Yu Jung and asking her why she killed V. And her initial response was once again fabricated. She said that she didn't actually kill her, but she was disposing of the body for somebody else. And she had a deal with the killer that once she disposed of the body, she could take over V's identity. And then she changed her story again and said that they got in a physical altercation and she ended up killing her. But that's not what happened at all. Remember when I said that Yu Jung really liked true crime? Now, a lot of us really like true crime content and watching those documentaries, but her angle on it was very different. She kind of had, well, instead of being like, that is awful, oh my god, poor victim, her thought process was, I wonder what that feels like to kill. She wanted to know what the murderers felt like, not what the victims felt like. Like, I think that we all do that to some degree. We think like, you know, like Dahmer. I wonder, you know, what was going on in his head. But that wasn't her. Her was, I wonder what it's like to kill. She was inspired more than disgusted by the crimes. Her fantasy continued to grow into curiosity. According to investigators, she was planning this murder for around 3 to 4 months. And yes, I've restarted my eyes. She ended up meeting her victim on a tutoring website for English. She initially posed as a parent who wanted a tutor for their kid, and she organized a meeting date with V. She then put on a fake schoolgirl outfit and went to V's house posing as the student, and then she stabbed her to death. This woman lost her life because someone was curious. After that, she went to a store and bought bin bags and bleach and then dismembered the body. And now the story loops back around to the taxi journey. And yeah, Yu Jung ended up being like, yeah, I just wanted to know what it was like, guys. Why are you being so judgmental? It didn't take long to prosecute her because they had all the evidence they needed. They had CCTV footage, etc., and she was charged with a multitude of things. You know, murdering someone, dismembering of a body, concealing a body, etc. When stopped by the press, she made a very kind of dull speech where she was like, I'm sorry to the victims' families, but it didn't seem very genuine. It was very rehearsed. According to the people who work in the prison that she's in, she doesn't seem to be showing any remorse. On a psychological note, a lot of people believe that during her long periods of isolation, she developed psychopathic tendencies, and she desired the educational and social life possessed by her victim. I really wonder if she was given the opportunity, if she would do it again, or if the one kill was enough for her to know. I would love to hear what you guys have to say about this case, so make sure you let me know in the comments. And thanks for watching this video. See you in the next one. Bye!
The Long Island serial killer, also known as the Gilgo Beach Killer, has just been arrested. This is breaking news. And the suspect was arrested last night in his Midtown Manhattan office. And his identity has just been released today. And I'm gonna tell you everything about who he is and how he was tracked down. And he was also sometimes referred to as the Craigslist Ripper or the Manorville Butcher. But first, if you haven't heard of him before or you need a refresh on the whole thing, we are talking about an unidentified, or at least until recently unidentified, suspected serial killer. He was believed to have ended the lives of about 10 to 18 people. And all the bodies were discovered over a period of few months between 2010 and 2011. They were disposed of in areas on the south shore of Long Island, New York. And it is believed that the suspect met some of these people through Craigslist. And 4 of the victims were designated the Gilgo 4. And they were all discovered within a quarter mile of each other in 2010, near Gilgo Beach. And at least 6 more sets of remains were found in 2011. And I'm pretty sure if you live in Long Island, New York, or anywhere in New York City, you've probably heard of this before. And for a long time, it was suspected that someone in law enforcement was behind these horrible acts. But let's get into what we know about the suspect in custody right now. His name is Rex Heuermann, and he is a 59-year-old architect that works in an office in Midtown Manhattan. And that is where he was arrested on the evening of July 13th of 2023. So that's yesterday at the time I'm making this video. He is a married father of 2, and he owns the New York City architecture firm where he was working. And it is unclear what exact developments led to his arrest. We are being told that he is being charged with ending the lives of 3 of the victims, and is a suspect in a 4th. And they are saying he lives in Massapequa Park, and that is just north of Gilgo Beach, the place where remains were found on the edge of a highway, a remote oceanfront highway. And that was again back in 2010 and 2011. So how was he tracked down? 2 years ago, Suffolk County Police Commissioner, by the name of Rodney Harrison, restarted the investigation and put together a task force. Authorities are saying it had a lot to do with phone records. Thousands of records collected and reviewed. And there was also a connection to a green pickup truck that apparently a witness had seen the suspect driving. And eventually, investigators were able to obtain DNA. And they obtained it from an immediate family member of Hewerman. That DNA was later sent to a specialized lab, and it ended up matching to a burlap sack. A sack that contained one of the bodies found by the beach. Right now, the investigation is still ongoing. You might see pictures of this belt buckle going around. That is something found at one of the crime scenes and believed to be handled by the suspect. Honestly, this is all a lot to take in right now. And I will try to keep you updated on any new developments that we learn about. Okay, bye guys.
It's time for Cookies and Crime. This is the case of Angie Huseman. Angela Mary Huseman was born on February 18, 1984 in St. Louis, Missouri. She was a happy and bright kid with a big smile. In 1993, Angie was a fourth grader at Buter Elementary School in St. Anne, Missouri. On November 18, 1993, Angie got off the school bus on her block like she did every afternoon. Usually, two parents in the community would watch the kids as they got off the school bus and walked home. But on that day, parents were busy. Angie only had to walk 8 houses to her home, and as she passed the 4th house, she disappeared. When it took her more than 30 minutes to get home after school, her mother and stepfather became concerned. Sometimes she would stop to talk to the neighbors, but it never took this long. They searched the neighborhood and found no sign of Angie. Her parents quickly reported her as missing and an investigation began. Her parents were heavily questioned, and her stepfather even took a polygraph test, but it didn't produce any leads. On November 21st, the FBI got involved. Psychics were even called on to help in the investigation, and one psychic claimed to dream about the police finding Angie's body in the August Busch Wildlife Area. Then, on November 27, 1993, 9 days after she disappeared, a deer hunter found Angie's body in the August Busch Wildlife Area almost exactly where the psychic said she would be found. Her body was tied to a tree. She was handcuffed and her whole face was covered in duct tape except for her nose. The autopsy showed that Angie was tortured. She was beat, starved, and severely dehydrated. Her hair was also cut and colored. It was likely that Angie died just hours before her body was found, and the official cause of death was hypothermia. She had been tied to the tree alive and died from the elements of the environment. Before she disappeared, Angie had told her teachers and friends that she was going to the countryside with her uncle, but there was no uncle, and none of her friends knew who this person was. Decades went by and Angie's case remained unsolved. In 2016, Angie's mother tragically died of cancer. In 2018, police decided to re-evaluate Angie's case. With new advanced technology, DNA testing on Angie's underwear was able to produce a profile of a male suspect. The DNA matched a man who was already in federal custody. This man was Earl Cox. On November 18, 1993, Cox was driving to his sister's house when his car broke down in front of Angie's stop. When Angie walked past him, he asked her if she was hungry. She said she was cold and hungry and agreed to get in his car. He took her to Burger King and bought her food, then drove her to his home. That would be the last time anyone saw her alive. He was sentenced to life in prison. After over 25 years, justice was served.
On Friday, my phone was blowing up saying, "Have you heard there's a suspect that was arrested for the murders on Gilgo Beach?" And he's a dad. In 1995, my father was arrested for serial murder, and I was 16 years old when he was arrested. One thing that I've been following now since the suspect was arrested is all the articles coming out about his supposed double life, and I could speak on this. I'm also not alone in being the only person who could speak about this. There are other daughters of serial killers that could speak about this, and I can tag some of them in here that are open about talking about their experience. So like the suspect, when my father was away from our family is when he would strike and kill his victims. And I'm reading reports that this suspect would wait till his family was on vacation to lure and kill his victim. This suspect also reminds me of serial killer Robert Yates and the fact that he would have his family on vacation and strike and kill his victims. One victim in particular, he buried at his property by the window of his daughter. Adjectives being used for the suspect are creepy and weird, and that he stole oranges from a Whole Foods. Those are the same adjectives that I would use for my father as well. I believe those adjectives are caused by the narcissism, the grandioseness that they feel entitled. It's just part of their antisocial personality disorder. A profiler could speak more about that. Having lived with a serial killer, I can speak on some other things. So in my case, my father used his family as a mask of insanity. He actually would lure some of his victims by talking about how he was a dad and how he had just been to my birthday party, and that would get them comfortable with him. I'm seeing now that everybody is in shock, like he looks so normal, and that's what is so crazy about these cases, is that a killer like this, a serial killer, could live amongst us and you don't even know. Not even his family could know. And this is why I say family members of perpetrators or killers or serial killers are victims too, because they are blindsided. They live with the killer, not knowing. And people always come up to you and say, how did you not know you lived with them? They're very good at hiding their double life. So when I see news reports like this, another killer found, I'm always grateful that the police and detectives are doing their job and they're finding these serial killers or finding these killers. But I always think about the families of the killers too, because while there's some closure for the victims' families, there's also a new unrest for the perpetrator's family. They're now uncovering a whole nother world, another life that was happening in their midst.
Curtain number 1 is correct.
Her arms were cut off. Her legs were cut off. Her ears were cut off. Her tongue was cut off.